If you ask the average sister or brother why they're not black, or why you don't, or why they shouldn't call themselves black, they would be lost unless they were willing to sit down and listen for a while to the rationale for where this comes from. Like I said, understanding systems of oppression is key to being able to resist oppression. If you don't understand what the motivation was for putting that into place in the first place, you don't know how to deal with it. And if you want to, like I said, if you want to speak of we as highly melanated people, or we as NUC, or we as I would say, people of predominant African ancestry, that makes more sense to me. I'm just saying. So when I looked at what Drew Ali was trying to convey, and did convey, obviously, to those who heard what he was saying, back in the early teens and 1920s in particular, that you are not black, you are not Negro, you are not colored. Just on a psychological level, I can see the value. I haven't even gotten into what the value and importance of what he was saying by having folks reject calling themselves Negro, black, or colored, because that's a whole nother issue. I just got into the psychology of it, right? So the value of not identifying with black is it compels you to be more specific in identifying culture, knowing your geographic origin, knowing your history. Yet, again, Moor is a reference to a people, to an empire that covered a geographical location. The Moorish Empire at one time was from the northwestern part of the Maghreb or North Africa all the way down to the Senegal River and as far east as the border of Egypt. That's part of what, and I'm just talking about what we know as the recognized Moorish Empire in terms of international and diplomatic history and relations. So we can say that covers a wide swath of the African continent. That would include Africans of various hues, people who would be darker in complexion and others who'd be lighter in complexion. And the primary sources from Duarte, Portuguese travelers, and Azrara and English sources all affirm that the term Moor was used for people of African ancestry. Later, the term blackamoor is introduced, but it's part of the development of the kind of pigmentocracy direction that exists. And even in the medieval period, when the Templars referred to living a good life as a pure and white life, which meant they were supposed to be honorable men, which meant they were supposed to respect life and live as Christ had instructed as far as we understood it. But that was the phrase, a pure and white life. So they're using a term for themselves that's meant to affirm and empower. Because like I said before, in referencing, Biko versus the judge, he said, you're more pink than white. So why do you call yourselves white? Well, because white is a lot more culturally affirming of our power, our divinity, our superiority than calling ourselves pink. Seeing the importance of a name, right? Names, words have power. The ancient Kemetic principle of Nommo, the power of the spoken word. These are things that I also was exposed to in Africa-centered circles, which is why it was so odd for me that I had people trying to affirm blackness or black. To me, like I said, there's something else going on. So I say again, other folks are not calling themselves yellow Americans. There's no yellow power. There's no yellow consciousness. And those groups of people who are Asian, of different nationalities, they have tended to do pretty well, even in the face of what we know as so-called global white supremacy, right? And yes, I know that they know more about themselves, their culture's more intact. I agree. That's exactly why I'm telling you, figure out what your culture is so you can spread it and make it more influential within your community. We're talking about Africans or Moors who were simply subjugated and oppressed and suffering from amnesia, right? So if you call yourself a Negro and you don't see any value in yourself and you believe in the inherent superiority of this new system that you're in, I'm talking about in the context from the 18th through the 20th centuries, I dare say even into the 21st century, then that means you don't see the value of who you are, which means you don't know who you are, which means you don't know your history, which means you have amnesia. The Austrian cartoonist Volk does this image showing Lincoln, as he says, under the veil, as if he was saying, I'm revealing who this person actually is. What made this different from the usual caricatures of Lincoln, some caricatures that could be seen in things like Harper's, which was a dominant journal during the time, would show him almost looking buffoonish or like an ape and things that were very derogatory. But Volk's Under the Veil was not really anything that was offensive in terms of his phenotype. He just looked like a Moor wearing Moorish attire. So that got my attention because it made me ask the question, did Volk, as a European immigrant, also know that Moors were clearly an African people, but also did he know something about these links to Lincoln's own family? And I might even add, recently there was a historian, I forget their name, but they gave a presentation where they talked about Lincoln's work with something known as the William Dungy case in 1855. And that William Dungy case was where Dungy in the state of Illinois was found to have gotten in trouble with people in the society who accused him of not being quote unquote white. And they were arguing that he was a Negro. Lincoln defended him and argued that he was of Moorish ancestry. So that's another element of American history that's often overlooked. Now, why wouldn't people look more deeply at why Adelbert Volk did this? In fact, Volk had to flee the country in part because of his Confederate sympathies. But he came back in 1864, at least according to what Rufus Wilson says, and then produced a collection of his caricatures, but mysteriously didn't include this original one of Under the Veil showing Lincoln looking Moorish. So, you know, part of what this suggests to me is there clearly were Europeans, European Americans in the United States in the 19th century who were still fully aware of some Moorish aspect to the history of not just the United States, but the colonies which had preceded it. I didn't go into this saying, you know, I got to prove Moorish science right. I went into it from the start going, I'm not sure. But then as I kept saying, I said, wait a minute, ancient Kemet, the prophet's talking about Kemet. We got several chapters in the Moorish Quran reference. Why is Kemet what's the Gnostics? And what is the Gnostics are saying things similar. The Marabouts, the Murids, so I'm like, wait a minute. Then Ivan Van Sertima, they came before, wait a minute. We were here in the Americas. All this is contained in Moorish science, right? So then I said, that's deep. And then to go into the diplomatic history and the legal history, and I'm going, this is real. What's so frustrating for me, as you can imagine, is that I wish more of us knew about it, even those who are affiliated with temples. The reason why I wrote the book is because and even the style of it, because I've even had my colleagues come and say, why do you have so many sections that have bold, and then you italicize? I said, understand, I didn't write this book for you or I, meaning the average academic. I wrote this book for those within the Moorish American community and the larger African American community. I even say the larger, quote unquote, Latino or Asiatic Spanish-speaking community, so that we could look at it and the bold things are meant to stand out. So you can really emphasize that and certain things that I highlighted, because I know essentially how most people read if they're part of, people say, the rank and file. And yet I had to produce something that was chock full of primary and secondary sources from reputable scholars, that was in one locale. The term Moor or Moorans or Mores is used to refer to what we would say are so-called black people, what is more accurately African people, particularly African people of a darker olive complexion, but it can vary. In fact, when Leo Africanus, who was a Moor taken captive and then converted to Catholicism, and then wrote a book about the history of the Moors, and he basically says the proper name for what people were calling Ethiops or Ethiopians or so-called Negroes was Moor. That's why the word Moor is so pervasive in so many languages. French, it's Muir. As I already said, Germanic languages, it's Moor, M-O-H-R. And in part, people say it's because of the association with the Roman, the Latin mores. But then the Greek preceded it, the Mavros or Moros. But as I said already, its origins are most certainly in Africa. So it was an indigenous term. The reason why the transition occurs is because as the Moors lose power, those European forces that are taking over see the need to start to denigrate, and I use that word intentionally, and devalue the African person, the African woman and man in history, in order to justify the new conditions. The new conditions are now Europe is in ascension. Plus, I dare say it also has to do with what then emerges with something known as the law of nations, because theories around nationality and what that means and the law of nations and then treaties comes into play. So you have people of European Christian ancestry saying, we have to emphasize now our greatness by devaluing the African. That's a part of it, and not all, but I would venture to say most who are in positions of power start to adopt that view. Then the second thing that they do is they understand that since we're talking about nations and the law, if we recognize you as a nation under the sacred treaties, in fact, Emeric de Vattel, who was recognized as having talked about the law of nations and the sacredness of treaties, said nations should respect other nations. But if you create a situation where folks are under the law made into non-persons, then what you're doing is creating a condition for their legal oppression. Now, it ain't right, don't get me wrong, It ain't right. I'm not just because people will try to say, well, but so you're saying the legal. I'm not saying that that doing that is justified, because it's still immoral. You're still oppressing and abusing a people. But what I'm explaining is how the law works within that context.
This series and many others can only be found exclusively on Amexem. Quickly sign up with our 3-step process to get started. The link to access your trial is in the description below. We'll see you in the next chapter. Peace and love.